Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Proverbs. Proverbs are a type of rhetoric. They're not necessarily a type of rhetoric you're often going to use or see in scholarly or academic writings. You're probably not using Proverbs too often in your essays for school, for instance, but Proverbs are nonetheless an important rhetorical genre. So basically, a proverb is a short, recognizable saying that encodes wisdom, communal wisdom, typically. You can, on occasion, create your own proverb, but for the most part, that's not how proverbs work. They tend to be handed down through generations. Again, this is about communal wisdom, typically. So things like the early bird catches the worm. The leopard can't change its spots. You can't teach you can't teach an old dog new tricks. A lot of proverbs are animal-based, but not all of them are. Things like when you have a hammer, when all you have is a hammer, every problem begins to look like a nail. You've got to spend money to make money. There are definitely proverbs that are not animal-based, but a lot of them are. And that's somewhat arbitrary. It deals with the way in which communal wisdom is typically created. It tends to go back several generations, and one common reference point that most people within a society will have is animals. But again, there are ones, boys will be boys. Dead men tell no tales. That don't have any sort of animal element to them, but they are in some sense recognizable, and their meaning is recognizable. And that's really the important part of a proverb, is that when we hear a proverb, at least a proverb from our own culture, from different cultural contexts, proverbs may be complete mysteries to us. And you do sometimes see, especially if, like me, you sort of build your social media in such a way that you get a lot of literary and sort of multicultural stuff popping up in your feed. You will sometimes see things like proverbs from around the world, and some of them you're just like, why would anyone ever say that? Because it's not your cultural context. But within your cultural context, a proverb will make perfect sense. What it means, what wisdom it encodes, should be pretty immediately recognizable, right? So when we say, for instance, boys will be boys, what this means is a man of some age, whether or not a boy or an adult, whether a child or an adult, is doing something stupid and wrong. But the nature of men is to do things that are stupid and wrong. And this is the wisdom that's encoded in here. The early bird catches the worm. Those of us from the cultural context that produced this saying, we know that this means if you get up and start work early, you will be successful. Success comes from hard work and avoiding laziness, avoiding sleeping in, etc., etc. We know what these things mean. And so this is really what differentiates a proverb from a cliche, because on the surface they look very similar, right? Because a cliche is a standardized stock phrase that we recognize without really thinking about it. And proverbs can be this as well. There are proverbs that are so cliche that we no longer really think about what they mean. They just create that association with the idea. But cliches don't inherently encode wisdom. So a phrase like busy as a bee, happy as the day is long, whatever it is. These are These are stock phrases that we culturally recognize, but they don't really tell us something. They don't give us a profound lesson. Proverbs will, even though, again, they may be quite standard, quite stock phrases. Incidentally, one of my favorite proverbs at the moment is "God sends nuts to those who have no teeth," which I just think is a great one. But in terms of Proverbs' rhetorical purpose, again, this is probably not something you would use in scholarship or academic writing for classes, things like this. But in sort of day-to-day rhetoric, Proverbs show up all the time, right? Your parents or whoever it is recognize that you're facing some sort of problem, and they may give you a proverb, some sort of nugget of wisdom to try and help you through whatever the situation is. Let's say you just had a bad breakup. Someone may say, "Time heals all wounds." This is a proverb. Obviously, it means once you get more distance from this event, even though it may seem catastrophic right now, it won't seem so bad in the future. Whether or not that's comforting is a different question. Sometimes, especially at times of heightened emotions, some proverbs are not only not comforting, but maybe actively upsetting. One good example might be after something bad happens, say a death of a friend, death in the family, something like this. If you say to an atheist or an agnostic, "God has a plan," boy howdy, are they not going to find that wise. So you do want to be careful and strategic with your use of proverbs in everyday rhetoric. Some cultural contexts do tend to use proverbs much more, especially in creative writing, in storytelling, things like this. West African literature, for instance, post-colonial West African literature especially, often relies on characters giving proverbs, or even sort of dramatizations, narratizations of proverbs themselves. And in part, this was about sort of re-legitimizing pre-colonial wisdom, pre-colonial ways of knowing things, etc., etc. So authors like Chinua Achebe, Femi Osofisan, Amaata Aido, people like this will put proverbs into the mouths of their characters, in part because this sort of re-legitimizes indigenous ways of knowing. There are also, from many of the cultures around the world, maybe not all of them, but most of them, there are bodies of what are called wisdom literature. And wisdom literature often involves a lot of proverbs. It involves a lot of knowledge just generally about how to exist in the world, the nature and purpose of existence, what the role of society is, these kinds of questions. Philosophy, essentially. But it's wisdom literature is often constructed of sort of discrete bits and pieces of knowledge, information, and proverbs, things like this. The Cotton Maxims from medieval England, for instance. Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. Meditations? That doesn't sound quite right, but I think it is. The writings of Marcus Aurelius, regardless. All of these different, so these are a couple of examples, but there are examples from across the world of collections of proverbs, wisdom, knowledge, things like this, that are not, they're not sort of organized, centralized arguments in the way that, say, a contemporary book of philosophy is supposed to be. They are bits and pieces. Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Nietzsche, I think, is another one. These are just the random examples that are coming into my head. So they aren't making a single core argument. They are meant to be sort of catalogs of wisdom, and Proverbs play a big role in those. So again, this is an element of rhetoric that has very specific instances in which it's going to show up. But within those instances, Proverbs play an important role in terms of preserving and passing on wisdom across generations.